I'm very pleased this morning to introduce Senior Consultant Terrance Thiel, or TJ. Morning,
Correct.
TJ.
Good morning.
TJ has a lengthy background in auditing and specifically in MDSAP. He spent some time with Becton Dickinson, a large firm, spent a lot of time with a small startup in the diagnostic space, and supported AdvaMed during the implementation of the whole MDSAP program, was involved heavily in that. So TJ is extremely knowledgeable. He's our go-to on MDSAP around here. And today he's going to talk to us about why MDSAP opens a world of possibility. So I know you're very enthusiac about this program.
Yes, absolutely.
So good morning, TJ, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Arthur. I truly, I don't think Arthur can push it enough how excited and pushing on the MDSAP audit program I can possibly kind of convey through my words. But hopefully this webinar will allow us to give you guys some insight into the MDSAP program. Also, give you some ideas as to what the differences are between ISO 1345 2016 and what the specific things that this is going to allow you to do as a medical device manufacturer. So let's get started. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to discuss what is MDSAP. We're going to talk about the participating countries in the MDSAP program, the eligible auditing organizations. We're going to talk about the comparison, as I spoke earlier, about 1345-2016 and MDSAP. Big thing is, documentation differences. What kind of expectations should you have as a medical device manufacturer when it comes to the documentation in your QMS? MDSAP is obviously an audit, and so I want to really talk about the requirements for that audit documentation. But bottom line is, what's the benefits here? What do we get out of performing a MDSAP audit? So I want to go into that. We've got some comments because MDSAP was in pilot program until recently. So we've got some early adopter comments and initial reviews. We've got some questions. Thank you for providing your questions ahead of time. As you have them, as Arthur's explained, please click on the Q&A button and add your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them along the way. And then we have our conclusion. So let's get started. So what is MDSAP? So ultimately, at the inaugural meeting in Singapore in 2012, the IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, recognized that a global approach to auditing and manufacturing or monitoring of the manufacturing of medical devices could improve the safety and oversight on an international scale. And it further identified a work group to develop specific documents for advancing a medical device single audit program, and that's what MDSAP stands for. So the medical device single audit program allows a MDSAP recognized auditing organization to conduct a single regulatory audit, and that's the key here, a single regulatory audit of a medical device manufacturer that satisfies the relative requirements, or the relevant requirements, of regulatory authorities participating in the program. Countries that are participating in the MDSAP that were part of the IMDRF, Australia with the TGA, Brazil with ANVISA, Canada with Health Canada, Japan with the PMDA, and the US with the FDA. Now, it should be noted that both the WHO pre-qualification for IVDs and the European Union are official observers of MDSAP. So they do take some of the requirements and use that as part of their auditing programs, and basically use them as a segue into some of their auditing programs. Right now, there are 14 organizations authorized to conduct MDSAP audits. You can see the list of them on the right here, BSI, DECRA, SI Global, TUV. There is a current list that's listed on the bottom left of your screen that the FDA maintains. That will describe the organizations that are eligible to do the audit, that are recognized by the MDSAP countries, so on and so forth. So that is the most up-to-date version, and they have updated them on a semi-regular basis, about every 2 to 3 months. As we talk about what the differences are between 1345 and 2016 and MDSAP, I think the biggest thing is that they're basically aligned. There's not a ton of things that are extremely different between these two processes. However, I do want to outline those significant differences. So the first one seems obvious, and that's the inclusion of geography-specific information. So it's really focusing on the regulatory requirements of those IMDRF countries. The second one is that the grading system for nonconformities is slightly different with MDSAP. Instead of going for a significant finding, regular finding, significant opportunity for improvement, we're really talking about a point-based system, and there's a slide next that'll kind of describe that a little bit more. And then the final thing is that there are 2 stages required for a MDSAP audit in the initial assessment. Stage 1, after the application's been reviewed by the auditing organization, the MDSAP assessment program reviews impacted documentation to determine preparedness for an on-site assessment. In stage 2, once the auditing organization is satisfied with your documentation and preparedness, an on-site assessment is completed, including QMS compliance to ISO 1345, as well as any other regulatory requirements for the IMDRF regulatory bodies. Surveillance audits are completed in the next 2 years, and then in the 4th year, usually there's a research audit for the MDSAP program. As I spoke about earlier, one of the significant differences is this idea of nonconformity grading. And the MDSAP audit program really focuses on the GHTF Quality Management System medical devices grading system, really focusing on the QMS impact, whether it's direct or indirect, and the occurrence, whether it's the first time it's happening or if this is a repeat. Obviously, as they are directly impacting or repeat occurrences, they increase the score, which is then taken in by the MDSAP auditor to determine whether your MDSAP preparedness is there. One thing I should point out is that there is a point that's added for the absence of a process or the release of non-conforming medical devices, which really means that the scoring system goes from 1 to 6. And what that, in broad details, if you get a 6, that's really suggesting that the MDSAP audit cannot be completed. That's a major finding under what would be typically ISO 1345, and that will be something that you have to fix before you can move forward. 5s, there is some allowance for maybe a 5 during your audit. However, that would require significant improvement on the quality management system. There is a level of number of 4s that if you do obtain those in your audit, need significant or need clarification or revision before the phase 2 can move forward, or any additional auditing activities can happen, and then so on and so forth. So,
TJ, can I just interrupt at that point?
Yep.
And I just want to understand this clearly as well, because so what we're talking about is each individual major observation, if you like, gets scored. So it's not a score for the whole audit, it's a score for each thing that comes up that's of significance.
Absolutely.
And that can be scaled on 1 to 6, and if you hit the 6, that means you've got something that's got a direct impact, it's a repeat occurrence, there's something wrong with the process, and you've also ended up releasing some non-conforming devices. And if you hit all of those bells, then you're not going to pass that particular audit at that time.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's very good point, Arthur. It really is on each individual audit aspect. So as there's a review of each of these items, they are all individually scored. So that's why when I say you could get a number of 4s or a number of 3s, that may lead to a different outcome, and as far as what additional activities you need to do to update your QMS in order for you to get a successful MDSAP audit completed. Okay. One of the key differences also, and we pointed to that as item number 1 on the previous slide, is documentation differences. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. There's, depending on how your QMS is set up, and how these things are incorporated into your QMS. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that only 5 documents need to be updated, but these are significant documentation differences in the MDSAP audit program. Pre-market regulatory, this is the idea that all of the requirements for the geography-specific regulations for MDSAP regulatory authorities are met. There's a requirement for authorized representatives in each of the MDSAP countries, medical device classification procedures for each of the MDSAP geographies, additional information about registration, reporting, things like that. Post-market regulatory, again, always going to push back on this geography-specific regulations, definitions of incidents, adverse events, complaints, an MDR process and analysis process, including a multi-region with all MDSAP geos analyzed, and vigilant reporting timelines for all of the MDSAP countries. With recalls and product notifications, they must include external notifications to all MDSAP-specific countries and the definition of contact and responsible parties in each of those jurisdictions. Design and development and design changes, again, you want to make sure that you have geography-specific regulations for your MDSAP regulatory authorities. You have definitions and procedures as per your regulatory plan and requirements, which present the regulatory strategy to achieve market access and to maintain that through design changes. And then obviously the discussion of what a significant change is, discussion of regional specific changes. So there are some changes that MDSAP specific countries are looking to be reported. That's the kind of things we're looking for in this documentation differences. Next slides, I'm going to kind of go through a little bit quickly because it really is here to give you guys an idea of what required documentation are needed for each of the MDSAP process and audit tasks. Again, Brandwood has recently gone through a couple of MDSAP audits and has done several to date. And so we've created this basic list of documentation to help you guys out to understand, okay, what are we looking for when we say, management in the MDSAP companion document? Well, what we're talking about is a quality manual, quality policy, objectives, org charts, so on and so forth. Again, in the MDSAP, there's a specific section about device marketing, authorization, and facility registration. What are the required documentations there? Measurement, analysis, and improvement. The required documentation is listed on the right. Adverse events and advisory notice reporting, design and development, and production and service controls.
Can I just, sorry, excuse me, I'm going to ask you another question as we go
Please
through.
Please do.
One of the things we see, we support a number of manufacturers marketing in this part of the world, in Australia and other parts of Asia Pacific. As those manufacturers are undergoing MDSAP audits, we're seeing requests to upgrade the contractual relationship between the manufacturer and the local market representative, in this case, which is Brandwood Biomedical.
Yep.
So you see, can we just expand on that a little bit? Because what we're seeing is that not only do the auditors expect to see, as you said, geographic specific information about what's required, the quality system addressing the specific regulatory requirements in all the markets, all the MDSAP participants that are marketed to, they want to see that written down in a contract so that there are formal relationships between the manufacturer and their local representatives.
Yeah, completely. It's a great question, and I think it's something that has actually gotten brought to light recently for us. I think that the biggest thing is that these MDSAP auditors are looking for execution. So they're looking at how you plan on executing these MDSAP requirements. So when they start pushing on, what contractual agreements that you have in place, they're really going back to this companion document and saying, okay, is your sponsor in Australia, for instance, able to complete the required tasks that are needed for the MDSAP audit? So really what it's coming down to is that in the documentation, you've basically said, this is what we're going to do. And then when you get to phase 2, they're asking, how are you going to implement this? And one of the easiest ways, and one of the ways that these auditors are looking for, are these contractual agreements to say, yes, I recognize that Brandwood Biomedical is going to be my sponsor in Australia. They're going to complete the following tasks which are required under MDSAP, and that's all been contractualized, agreed to, and that it's clear as to the responsibilities moving forward. So I think that, you know, the same applies to all the IMDRF countries and everybody who's applicable under MDSAP, but really that's what we're seeing a lot of right now.
So it's a contractual agreement that means that the local representative has the capacity to do the communications with the regulator, to file adverse event reports, to manage a safety alert or a recall.
Yep.
All of that sort of stuff, and it's got to be codified in a contract as well as have the processes there.
Exactly, and I think that's where it's really coming back to, can you execute what you said in your QMS documentation as to how you're going to support all of these geography-specific, you know, regulations. Okay, yeah. So I think, you know, obviously we don't do this just for fun, and we want to make sure that there's some benefit, or there's some you know, ability for the business to benefit from doing a MDSAP audit. And I think the biggest thing that I want to push on here is that regulators that are included in the IMDRF will use the MDSAP audit to substitute for evidence of the manufacturer's QMS certifications. I can't emphasize this enough. These countries will not require additional country-specific audits. Now, that doesn't eliminate the for-cause audits and the other things that come out of additional you know, submission work and things like that. But it does eliminate these QMS certification audits, and it creates, in some geographies, more efficient, more relevant pathways for product regulatory approvals. Okay. Let's start. So I want to go through each of the countries that are included in the MDSAP and just talk about the individual benefits. First one off the top here is Australia. And again, TGA has put out a guidance, the use of market authorization evidence from comparable overseas regulators and assessment bodies for medical devices. And effectively, that's really saying, if you do a MDSAP audit and you combine it with a Canadian, Japanese, or FDA approval, you can use that to obtain TGA registration, aka ARTG list inclusion for a medical device. And this is in addition to the existing pathway that the TGA has recognized, where if you get CE mark for your device and have 1345, you can move forward with the Australian registration. So it's basically adding additional ways to get to market without necessarily going after a CE mark or doing these kind of regulatory activities in parallel. So if we look at the next slide, that kind of outlines what I'm talking about here. So as we've said before, if we normally, you know, the grayed out box on the left is the existing pathway. So you know, you have European CE mark, you go through that, you have your QMS certificate, you're able to do your application audit and get on the ARTG. Now we've added additional pathways. So with a PMA or a 510K and a MDSAP audit, or a license for 3 or 2 in Canada and a MDSAP audit, or a Shonin or a Nisho in a Japanese QMS certificate or MDSAP audit, you're good to go. And that's really adding additional features or additional ability for people to get onto the market in Australia without going through the typical full conformity assessment or the CE mark pathway.
Now, it's early days, isn't it, for this? This has only come out a couple of months ago, but our history of doing Australian registrations based on CE certificates has been that TGA has become extremely efficient at that.
Yes.
And for low to medium risk devices especially, we're talking about gaining registrations in matters of just a couple of weeks or something like that. Based on the certificates alone, as you go up and get more high risk, then they do this application audit where they call in the other data. They'll call in the high level data, call in particularly the clinical evidence. And I think that's probably what's going to happen here as TGA steps into this program of now starting to recognizing US and Canadian and Japanese evidence, that they're probably going to want to see the clinical evidence reports in the early days. So I think people would expect
Yeah,
that's what's going to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not eliminating the ability for TGA to say that in the application audit, they want to see the CER, the DOC, the essential principles checklist. But this is just providing another pathway for you to get to that application audit.
And they're not going to come and audit you, and they're not going to do a full conformity assessment. It's going to be based on what's
So you're really getting the efficiencies of doing one thing and then being able to put that across multiple geographies. You remember, Arthur, 95% of the products that are getting on the market or ARTG listed in Australia are going through a CE mark pathway. So this is adding additional features. And as you said, they have become very efficient because of that sheer number. And so the logical outcome is that this will increase that, ability, and they will become more efficient as time goes on with this.
And it's going to be quite important with the current hiatus in Europe, as it's going to, for the near-term future, it's going to be more difficult to get a CE mark, so it's good to have alternate ways.
Well, and that's exactly the point here. With the MDR coming out and the kind of this shuffle with regulatory and notified bodies in Europe, any additional pathways is going to be a good thing. Yeah. Okay. If we move on to Brazil, again, the MDSAP audit certificates replace the Brazilian GMP certificates, and that's under the RDA 16213 requirements, or 2013 requirements. The key here is if you haven't had any NC grades of 4 and 5, again, per the grading matrix that we've shown earlier, and that all of your grades 1 through 3 are being addressed, it replaces the Brazilian GMP certificate, full stop. In Canada, the MDSAP audits certificates are replacing the CMDAS or CMDCAS certificates. That's per that regulation 32.2F, 32.3J, and 32.4P. Again, in 2019, and this is quite big, Health Canada is actually eliminating the CMDCAS certificate and going full stop to MDSAP audit certificates. So it is a key change for the regulator, but again, pushes on this idea of harmonization across multiple geographies, and as a manufacturer of medical devices, makes it easier for you to incorporate Canada-specific requirements in the early stages of your QMS to then give yourself that option for marketing and potential approvals in Canada.
And that's been pretty controversial because Canada have thrown everything behind MDSAP and gotten rid of CAMDCAS, moved from one to the other. I saw some numbers the other day which are interesting, looking at companies who are importing into the United States, marketing to the United States, and I looked at the Canadian and the league table of companies that import into the US, Canada being one of the biggest ones just because they're right next door, and then Germany and Switzerland and others. And although MDSAP has been a bit slow on the uptake in the US, obviously all of the Canadian companies who are active internationally are now got the MDSAP. It was difficult, but they've gone ahead and done it. So 100% of Canadian companies importing into the US are already in MDSAP pretty much.
Yeah.
But what was really striking was, less than 5% of US companies, but about a third of all the Swiss companies and the German companies marketing into the US are already MDSAP qualified. So this is growing up exponentially. The take-up of this program is really quite spectacular, as far as I can see.
Exactly. And two things that I'll point out here, Arthur, as you're probably aware, we have several clients that are Canadian based, and we understand this need, and we've seen them go really, get a lot of these MDSAP audits taken care of in the last 6 to 8 months because of this requirement and this replacement of the CAMDCAS certificates. The other thing is that's, the question you asked before as to the implementation of these MDSAP requirements. We're getting a lot of requests for that contractual agreement so that we can show execution of the MDSAP requirements for these Canadian companies, because it is completely replacing the CAMDCAS. If we move on to Japan, The PMDA accepts the MDSAP audit reports to reduce the burden for medical device manufacturers. Now, what that means is that they may, instead of performing an on-site audit, they may perform an off-site audit. They may perform an off-site audit with less documentation required as soon as you provide that MDSAP audit report. It's key that PMDA is actually encouraging foreign manufacturers to use the MDSAP audit reports for QMS inspection application. So they really want that to be the pathway that people are going for to reduce that burden, not only on the manufacturer, but also on themselves. And the communication between the MAHs, so the market authorization holder, and the manufacturers is necessary during that process, but they want those manufacturers to push that MDSAP audit report piece. Here's just a quick flow chart of how MDSAP will fit into the PMDA process, and this is actually taken directly from the PMDA. Going to the US, MDSAP audits are acceptable as the substitute for FDA routine inspections. So with the MDSAP audit, there's the expectation that you will not need a FDA audit at the time of your submission or during your routine inspection phase. Now, what that doesn't mean, or what that means, and what it doesn't necessarily substitute for are, as we spoke about before, for-cause audits, anything that's related to compliance follow-up, things that require pre- and post-approval audits, and then those that are related to the electronic product radiation controls.
All regulators are going to reserve the right to come and look.
Absolutely. It's not like this will be a free pass that you just now you don't have to let them in the doors. The expectations are still there that you're doing the right thing, and that if an auditor or an audit needs to occur from one of these organizations or one of these regulatory authorities, that they have that capability to do that.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question. It just occurred to me that so how does that work with the device listing system in the US? Because the way it works in the US, you get your regulatory approval, you list the device, register the sites, and that puts you on the Office of Compliance radar, and they schedule their audits. How do they know you've already got an MDSAP?
That's a good question, and frankly, I'm not sure how that communication works, and how they've communicated that through
I presume there must be a way for them to do that.
Yeah, I would assume so as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Certainly worth looking into. So we talked about the benefits, and I think it's important for us to understand, how this is actually translating to the medical device manufacturers. And so after the pilot program, which is actually completed this year, we've seen some of the initial reviews, and you can see there are quotes. MDSAP allows a reduction in the number of audits conducted, resulting in less business disruption. That's obvious. It was well planned and well organized audit expectations to allow you to plan the resources ahead of time. And that's because MDSAP has a fantastic companion document that basically goes through what they're going to audit, the expectation, and the regulations for each of the geographies specific. And then the qualified and competent auditing organizations conducting in a consistent manner. And that's what MDSAP's meant to be, is consistency and harmonization in what the expectation is for auditing and now being applicable to all of these geographies.
And that's certainly the feedback we've seen, isn't it? So that, a lot of concern that these are expensive, long audits. Well, they are more expensive, they are longer, but they're well done audits, and they happen once, and it's a much smoother process sometimes than having multiple.
Yeah, absolutely.
Audits, and once it's done, it's done. So I think we've seen that people have been quite relieved and surprised at how comfortable and experienced it turned out to be.
Yeah, I've got another quote from another organization that basically said, the MDSAP program allowed us to consolidate the global regulatory assessment process across multiple international locations, reducing internal costs while increasing overall predictability of these efforts across our global footprint. By minimizing disruption to business, we can focus on delivering the safest, most effective technology and advanced products where possible. So again, it's really pushing on the fact that you're reducing complexity, you're reducing burden to the manufacturer by creating this harmonized standard that people can basically understand fully what they're going to be audited to. They can prepare accordingly set aside the resources that are needed, do the documentation that's required as part of the QMS, set up those contractual obligations that you need to show that you're going to be effective in implementing that. But that's where this is really focused on. Okay. I think we are, so let me just step back here. So as we talk about this in conclusion, and we'll get into questions here in 1 second, really we need to focus on the fact that the pilots are done and they've been successful. As you can see from the initial reviews and kind of the comments that are coming from organizations that have gone through the pilot process, this is great for manufacturers. The regulators are accepting the content that's coming out of it, and everybody does see the benefits to this MDSAP program. So bottom line is we expect wider adoption. Manufacturers who are 1345 2016 certified are a long way there. They're very close to being able to support a MDSAP audit. So the amount of work is incremental from the 1345 and completely manageable to update your QMS to be successful in a MDSAP audit. MDSAP audits reduce and eliminate the steps for country-specific requirements in the IMDRF jurisdictions. Again, focusing on a harmonized audit program and eliminating these specific, country-specific by, basically showing compliance to all of them at the same time. You're reducing your regulatory burden to the manufacturers by a single audit rather than multiple audits and multiple geographies that need to be planned for. So in conclusion, as we've kind of said before, MDSAP truly does open a world of possibilities for medical device manufacturers. And I think, it's clear to us as we see the manufacturers, the medical device companies that are coming forward that are going for these MDSAP audits, they are in a very good position and give themselves a lot of flexibility when it comes to market access. Really, we work with a lot of clients that are at beginning stages and they are planning for MDSAP audit because they don't know where they want to market eventually, but they don't want to eliminate the possibility of being able to market to Brazil or to Japan or so on and so forth.
I remember having some conversations with regulators here about why can't you just take a 13485 audit? As you said, the requirements are almost the same. Mm-hmm. And I think the key thing here is this is about having a bunch of audit organizations which are recognized and trusted mm-hmm. by the IMDRF members that participate in this program. In other words, what you have here is an infrastructure of auditing which has got a regulatory oversight, and people and all of the participating regulatory authorities recognize the audit organizations, trust the audits, and therefore need to do less themselves. They're all trying to do less, which means that we now have an infrastructure which is, I think what's happened in Australia is a really interesting sign, because I would expect to see other jurisdictions starting to go down that path now that we've got an audit which is not just a quality systems audit, but it's an on-site regulatory audit where they look at the regulatory processes within the quality system, they look at the means of compliance. And now, as Australia is doing, is now saying, okay, with an MDSAP audit and somebody on the ground checking that the regulatory compliance is being addressed by the quality system, we can do less. We can now, in most cases, just recognize the certificate, or we might just look at one clinical evidence document or something. We're probably going to see other regulators looking to do this sort of thing.
That's the hope. I mean,
and then we do really start to get recognition of each other's decisions and reduction in regulatory burden.
Yeah, obviously, in this presentation, we've really tried to focus on the benefits and the effectiveness for the medical device manufacturers. But I think you could say the same on the opposite end, on the regulatory authorities, because effectively, if this wider body, the IMDRF, can say, we've got these audit organizations that we trust, that we feel like can do the work that we would normally do. And if you do this, we will accept it. it's not, not only are they reducing the burden for you as the manufacturer, but they're also reducing the burden on themselves because, again, they don't have to send an auditor out for every specific instance of somebody wanted to register. They can focus on the things that they want, that, specifically want to see. And, and as you mentioned, Arthur, Australia is an excellent example. We see 95% of all the products that are listed on the ARTG come through a CE mark.
Based on somebody else's regulatory system.
Exactly. And they've identified that as a very efficient manner, and they've gotten very good at accepting those and getting those products on the ARTG. By adding these additional things, now not only do manufacturers have another pathway, but they have another way to accept data from these organizations that they believe and trust to come back and say, okay, we accept that part. Maybe there's a couple little things that we want to, review specifically. And once we have that, you're free to, put it on the ARTG. Okay.
Thank you. Now, I think it's time to take some questions. We've got a whole ton of questions here. If we'll look at them each in turn now. If you do think of something later, feel free to ping us with an email. I'm going to start with a question here from Geraldine, who said, if you get that 6 score, that unacceptable score, is that going to result in you not being able to request a certificate for foreign government or a free sales certificate?
Yeah, it's a tough question. So I think ultimately what a score of 6 means is that you have a problem with your quality management system. Now, how that relates to you, and maybe Arthur, you might be a good person to respond to this, but I don't know how that.
Well, I think the answer, Geraldine, is going to be this: is that the certificate for foreign government or a free sales certificate, depending on which you're getting it from, is a statement from the national government that the product is able to be legally supplied. So if you currently have a product registration and an ISO 13485 certificate, then you are on the market and you can still get your CFG. If you go for an MDSAP audit and you get a 6, it means you're not going to get your MDSAP certificate, but presumably the ISO 13485 is also going to be struggling at that point. It's not over yet, but once you lose that certification, if you can't address those 6s, then that's then going to ultimately mean that your product is no longer able to be registered. But there's usually got to be some kind of formal process to remove the registration afterwards. And most manufacturers don't get that far down the track. They manage to fix the system before it gets to that. So I think that's the answer, Jeanette. It's not necessarily going to affect it in the short term, but a 6 is something that needs to be taken pretty darn seriously and fixed up.
Sure.
Okay. So thanks for that, Geraldine. Another one from Jeanette. Now, this is a question we hear all the time. Do you need to cover all the countries or nominate the countries you wish to target? And I know that's changed between the pilot and the full program. The way that works. You want to talk about how that works? Yeah.
So effectively, the MDSAP audit will identify the countries that are within scope. So you, at the time of the audit, you can decide that you're not. You don't have any plans to market to Canada or to Australia or whatever. And so they will take those out of scope and you will be provided a MDSAP certificate, but it will not have those within the scope of the certificate. So if you do go back, you'll have to increase, you'll do what do you want to call it? A gap assessment for those additional countries, and then get your certificate reissued with those countries being added.
But if you market in a MDSAP jurisdiction, then you have to include that market within the scope of your audit. You can't elect to exclude a country in which you are active.
Correct.
So if you're marketing in Australia and you have an MDSAP audit, Australia has to be within the scope.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why, in that documentation list that we presented in this, one of them is submissions. So if you are on the market somewhere and you have a document or you've submitted and you're approved or cleared in that jurisdiction, the expectation and the requirement of the MDSAP auditor will be that you have covered those requirements in your QMS.
Right. Okay. Now, another question from Royal. If CE is now an official observer for MDSAP, how are they going to benefit from it? or how to manufacture. So how's that going to work? The Europeans are at the table, but not implementing this yet.
Yeah.
The practical reality is that the MDSAP auditors are also European notified bodies.
Yeah, let's be clear. The majority of the auditing or official auditors for the MDSAP audit are traditionally notified bodies. And I struggle to find a situation where you wouldn't tick the box for ISO 1345 at the same time you do a MDSAP audit. Because again, as we said, the only thing is that you're adding additional requirements for MDSAP specific countries when you include MDSAP as part of this audit scope. So that really means that your CE type requirements are still going to be met through your ISO 1345 certificate. Now, how this plays out, especially with the changes to the MDR, that's to be seen.
So the observers from Europe are actually competent authority observers.
Correct.
The Commission
Yes.
competent authorities. In Europe, we have third-party conformity assessment with notified bodies. As we said, they actually happen to be the very same organizations, which are also MDSAP registrars.
Correct.
So the reality is going to be, if you're needing a CE mark, you'll appoint a notified body. If you're smart, you'll appoint one that can do a MDSAP.
Correct.
And they're going to come and do a single exercise, one would hope. They're not going to come back separately and do a CE audit. They're going to combine the two. And since there's an enormous amount of overlap, there's a lot of efficiencies there.
Yeah, agreed.
So that's how that's going to work. So I hope that answers your question there. Bill says, if you've not done so in the course of the prepared material, please indicate where we can find formal MDSAP documentation and what's in. So where do people go to find more information?
One of the best.
What's the most important?
Okay, so there's two major things that I can push on here. The FDA website has a specific section about MDSAP. So they've been very good about publishing all of that. Within those links on that page, you'll find the MDSAP companion document, and we can actually include that.
We'll include that in the follow-up.
In the follow-up. Ultimately, that is the best resource for what you're going to need and all the things that need to be addressed in a MDSAP audit.
FDA is maintaining a whole web page.
Yes, correct.
And that's where that up-to-date list of registrars is, which
Exactly.
I saw was updated just a few weeks ago.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. We have somebody who's asked anonymously, are they going to get the slides? Yes, let me make clear. Yes, this webinar is recorded. Everybody who's attended or registered will receive a copy of the slides afterwards, and we'll also send you a link to a complete video and audio recording if you want to review the webinar. So yes, that'll be coming. Another question from Royal, is there anything I should prepare or coordinate with the 5 MDSAP countries before the audit? What do you need to do up front?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that so there's a couple of ways I can answer this. So how would, when you go about preparing for a MDSAP audit, I think that there's some grand scheme kind of ideas that you should really consider. So you really need to take a gap assessment or a gap analysis of your QMS documentation and really assess whether the regional specific requirements are being met. And we talked about the documentation differences and the things that need to be included as part of the MDSAP audit. So I think that's clear in the slides. You need to make sure that your risk assessment and your risk management program is comprehensive, implemented, and effective. So that, again, this isn't just a MDSAP thing, but it also applies to the ISO 1345. You need to make sure that you are in a good situation when it comes to the risk assessment, because that is, the majority of this is based on risk. And then ensuring that your employees are competent, not just trained, but competent in the QMS is key. But going back to the question about, do you need to coordinate with those 5 countries? No. Effectively, the MDSAP audit is meant to eliminate that requirement for coordination. And because this is there's companion documentation that the IMDRF countries have reviewed and have accepted, that will allow you to do those things that are prescribed in that document and not require that coordination. It does not eliminate the coordination when you actually get to application or regulatory approval stage. So obviously you'll still do that.
But you're dealing with one quality systems auditor one on-site inspection.
Yes, correct.
And you just deal with that organization. You don't need to deal with all of the audit branches of the regulatory authorities as you currently do.
Exactly.
But the license submission stays the same.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Roman asks also, can an organization choose which country? I think we answered that one
correct
a few minutes ago. You as a minimum have to be audited against the requirements of the markets which you are actively supplying, but you can add other ones as an option.
Correct.
I know we've got a client at the moment who is not supplying here in Australia, but intends to do so in the future. So they're incrementing their MDSAP audit to add the Australian requirement in preparation for a future.
Absolutely.
Filing.
And one of the things that you'll get as part of the preparation for MDSAP audit and getting the auditing organization, aligned and ready to come in to do that audit is they will give you a form that basically says which of these countries do you plan on implementing into your quality management system, and at that point you can decide.
It's all done.
Yeah.
It's all done. Okay. Lewis asks, how does this actually accelerate market entry? What's the commercial benefit in time to market?
Well, ultimately, the two biggest things that we see. The two biggest things that we see are, one, it eliminates this auditing requirement for these individual countries. So that will reduce the timeline because you're not going through this individual process with each of these countries before you move forward in a submission type activity. The second thing really comes back to,
it's accelerating and enabling the market entry.
Yeah, and well, I'm just trying to read his question here. Yeah, so I think it's really about not having to perform those audits ahead of time, not having to go through that, and basically being able to have one quality management system that'll support all of that. And when you do actually get in, what we are seeing, and again, we'll use Australia as an example, and we hope that becomes something that gets adopted by other IMDRF countries, is that it creates a new pathway. So instead of having 510K, you get a 510K and you're like, okay, I've got regulatory approval. Previously in Australia, you would still have to go through a conformity assessment if you didn't have that CE mark.
Yeah, so most manufacturers will look into the larger markets, particularly Europe and the US. So both of those places require a full quality system.
Yep.
You're going to require this infrastructure. The point is, Lewis, you're not having to do it twice. You're not having to be audited. You've got a CE, now you've got to be audited by FDA.
Yep. Now
you've got to be audited by TGA. Now you've got to go and get audited by the PMDA. Or, people have got to be swapping audit reports and all that. No, that all goes away.
Yep.
So you do it once, and now you're good to go to move on to the next bit. So you're taking a whole lot of grief and time and delay out of the process.
Yeah.
So it's not going to speed up your first market.
No.
But it's going to speed up everything after the second.
Yep.
I think is the point.
Yep.
And with a lot less required.
Yeah, and like I said, there's also the opportunity that we're seeing in some of these countries that there's creating new pathways for regulatory approvals.
Still lots more questions here. Bill asks another one, says, what will be the impact here with the new medical device regulations and IVD regulations in Europe?
So obviously, as Europe doesn't accept the MDSAP audit per se, they are just official observers. The MDR doesn't directly impact the MDSAP requirements. And really what the biggest thing is that it's creating efficiency with these notified bodies to perform one audit rather than having to do multiple audits. So the hope is that we know with the MDR coming out and the kind of the shuffle of notified bodies in Europe that there's going to be a large gap in the ability for you to schedule audits to get CE mark for your product. That's going to take more time just because of sheer resource constraints. Mm-hmm. So what this provides is another option to do these MDSAP audits and to get your quality system certified or assessed, and then go into these other markets. But as far as the direct relationship between the MDR and MDSAP, there's really no ties,
I guess it's the same comment as we made before, that the notified body can schedule a combined audit where they do a CE audit and a MDSAP audit if you're in multiple markets, and that will be just as valid under the medical device regulations. And in fact, it's going to be probably more important because they're so stretched at the moment.
Exactly.
I'm seeing people saying now that most notified bodies are talking 9 to 12 months as a waiting list now. If you haven't got your notified body sorted out for the medical device regulation, then you're going to find it kind of difficult because they're all full.
Exactly.
So this provides efficiencies which are just going to be really important in that circumstance.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Another question here from Royal. We're not yet CE certified, but planning to apply later. If we get audited for MDSAP and get certified, do we need to get the CE marking since Europe is sitting as observer? So no, the answer, I think we've just covered that. No, you've still got to go through that CE process. This doesn't replace a CE marking.
Correct. Yeah.
So no, the answer is you're still going to need to go through that process later.
But as Arthur pointed out, rightly, these MDSAP auditors are capable of doing, because they are notified bodies in most cases, they are capable of doing the 1345 audit, so that you can do that at the same time, create efficiencies there, and then you finish your technical file and you can get into the a CE mark situation for either submission or self-declaration.
Jeanette asks a question and says, if you've already got 13485/2016, what's the arrangement for doing MDSAP? Is there a transitional? Is there some reduced process, or what do you have to go through to then get an MDSAP?
Well, that's a very valid question, because I think the majority of companies are going to be in that situation. So ultimately, the first thing is your notified body on the list of auditing organizations that's capable of doing MDSAP? If so, realistically, you're just asking them to come in, do the kind of gap assessment for the MDSAP requirements, and then get you MDSAP certified, because they've reviewed the majority of your quality, documentation. Now, it reduces the time, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. I haven't heard of many that are going to do virtual audits to just say, here's the documents that we've now implemented the regulations for all of the IMDRF countries, so we're good. So it reduces that time, but it makes it efficient with you.
And I guess it depends on when your last audit was and whether it was an observation, whether it was a surveillance audit or a certification audit.
Correct.
So it's going to be where you are in the audit cycle as to how much efficiency can be built into that.
Absolutely.
So it's not a particularly precise answer there, Jeanette, but it depends to a certain extent on how much and how recently your ISO 13485 auditor has done, and if they are also designated to do.
Correct. And I think that the other side of that question is, if my notified body isn't part of the auditing organizations that are recognized by the IMDRF, if MDSAP is the pathway that you want to go forward with, you'll have to identify whether your audit or your notified body will become one of those auditing organizations through communication with that notified body, or may have to look at a switch. And again, as we've talked about with the current MDR things, and with the kind of the lack of resources in these notified bodies, that can be a bit of a tricky way.
Okay. Another question here which relates to incremental audits. Philip says, does the audit change depending on the countries you're selling into? So he says, if you add a new market, say for example, later you add Japan, we haven't marketed before, what happens then? So that becomes just an extension of scope.
Yeah, so the two things you can do is, if you preemptively just go after all, in your initial MDSAP audit, you include Japan even though you're not selling there, then there's no additional activities. You're already, certified for your Japan sale or Japan requirements in your QMS if you've done it at that time. But in the situation where you didn't have that as part of your original scope, it would be an increase in scope. There'd be a slight gap assessment by the notified body to ensure that those requirements are captured in your QMS, and then you'd be able to move forward.
We're seeing an example of that at the moment, where somebody's wanting to go to a new market, the company that's coming into Australia, and the advice they're getting from their audit organization is it's probably around a half to 1 day on site to do the increment. To come and do a look at the Australian specific regulatory documentation and processes. So that's the sort of impost to add another market. It's not a week's worth of audit. it's about a day.
Yeah.
To do the increment.
Correct.
Providing all the rest of the quality systems already been audited.
Yes, that's
okay. Let's see. Roman again asks, what about the technical file? Is the country-specific technical file review also part of the MDSAP audit?
So the answer to your question is not really. But what the thing that you need to remember is that phase 2 is going to look at the implementation of your MDSAP requirements of your QMS in your company. And so one of the things that they may look at is a technical file to say, this is, you've identified all of the appropriate countries for launch, you've included the regulatory requirements in your strategy documents, so on and so forth, and that all of the requirements are going to be met, and that's the implementation or evidence of implementation as part of phase 2.
So it's going to be, it depends on the risk class of the device as to what happens with that technical file, but I'm assuming that it's going to be a bit like what happened with CAMDACAS, where the CAMDACAS auditors didn't necessarily review the technical file for adequacy of the information, but they reviewed it for it being present and complete.
Yeah.
So in other words, the auditors on site are checking that the technical files exist, are being maintained, the risk assessment's being done, and all that sort of stuff. They won't necessarily form a judgment on the adequacy of what's being done. That's still part of the regulatory review for the product registration.
Correct.
But they are supporting the regulator by checking that everything's in place.
And doing that you've properly implemented the
and the processes to maintain
exactly processes.
Yeah. Okay. So another question from Lewis. Since the MDSAP requires evidence of execution, how do companies planning to go to market have to prepare for meeting MDSAP requirements? For example, in Australia, do they have to secure a local sponsor before obtaining the ALTG to pass the MDSAP audit? I guess it's chicken and egg. What do you got to do first?
Well, I mean, ultimately, that's one of the things that they've broken up into this phase 1, phase 2 idea within the MDSAP audit. So phase 1 obviously is the QMS, making sure that it applies all of the requirements.
2-phase audit.
Yeah, to the actual QMS. The phase 2 piece of that is the showing the implementation of that in your documentation, and that's where a sponsor, if you have included Australia in the scope of your MDSAP audit, that you have shown the contractual agreements for a sponsor in Australia to help you get through that piece and to meet all the requirements that they need to do as a sponsor of that country.
Okay. Question here from Tracy. Says, seems that MDSAP audits have got a lot of benefits to the manufacturer, especially if you're looking at worldwide distribution. But what's the potential negatives? What's the downside?
Yeah. So, we focused on a lot of the positives here, and I think that those become evident as you've read through the slides and listened to us today. But I think, the biggest things that I can push forward as far as the potential negatives, and I say potential because I do have a bias and believe that the MDSAP audit is a good thing. But the few negatives that I can point out, I think you're looking at increased time and cost for audits. And that really also includes the availability of the audit organization. So again, there's only 14 available. And if you're not part of one of those as your notified body, you're having to get that on the schedule. They're booked up, as Arthur said, sometimes 9 to 12 months in advance. So that does become an issue. And there is additional costs that have to be considered there because they are reviewing additional scope. Sometimes the cost justification for small companies that aren't sure of their markets may not be there. So, there is additional cost to this. To me, it's quite minimal when you think about the grand scheme of things, but if you say, there's just absolutely no way because of the climate or the what the device is that I'm going to go to one of these countries, then there's no reason to. It's just adding cost for something that's never going to happen. And then again, the other thing is, if you are in a situation where your notified body is not one of those audit organizations that's recognized by the MDRF, you would have to transfer, and there is some communication and some auditing nuances, differences that would be expected between those two notified bodies.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're almost out of time. One last quick one I just want to say here. The registrar will audit us for MDSAP, but they don't do CE. Is it ideal, or should you just hire one that can do both? I mean, it's not impossible to, but you're going to be dealing with two separate organizations. Yeah. So I think strongly is look for one that can manage both.
Yeah, our recommendation would definitely be to find one that can manage both, because not only do you reduce that communication gap, but you also provide that efficiency to your organization.
Sure. Well, thank you, TJ. It's been an interesting discussion and an enormous number of questions this time round. We've I think got to all of them. Thank you to our audience for participating so much and asking all those questions and allowing for this discussion. If you think of something later, do ask us by email. help@brandwoodbiomedical.com will reach us. We'd be happy to come back to you individually. So that's all for now. We won't have a webinar in December. We'll have a little break for Christmas. But in the meantime, if you need some more information, you can have a look at our website, follow me on Twitter, follow us on LinkedIn, and we have a YouTube channel and also a page on our website where all of these webinars are recorded and the videos are up there. So thanks very much, and good morning or good evening to you all.
Thank you all.